Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, we're back for another week to talk Daredevil, comics, and a little bit of history all rolled up into one.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. This week we are continuing with this whole massive expansion era for Marvel and the direct market. Going to be a number of new creators coming in and starting some important runs. We've got a bunch of new companies that enter the market, and there are a whole lot of turtles to talk about this year. Technically 4, I guess. But,
sure. I suspect I have a little bit of an idea what you might be referring to. And yes, the turtle power does seem to have made its beginning around this time. And the comic world and pop culture in general, I don't think we're the same ever since.
Absolutely correct.
The year in comics. All right, Dan, the year is 1984, and there is a lot going on from your introduction there. Where do we start? What is new and noteworthy in 1984? Do we start with the Turtles, or do we start elsewhere and then make our way to some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, perhaps?
I think we can start elsewhere. There's a bunch of stuff going on. So as usual, I start out with DC on a lot of these. I think we'll do that again. DC has some interesting stuff going on this year. They continue to bring a lot of interesting stuff to the direct market and keep moving those along. Probably the most important thing that happened for DC Comics, and one thing that, in terms of sort of the future development of the hobby, one of the most important things that happened, period, this year, was that Alan Moore started his run on Swamp Thing. So with issue number 20, this relatively unknown British author came over and took on a nondescript title that's generally, canceled about after 15 or 20 issues. Nobody would have ever thought that Alan Moore and Swamp Thing would become the most celebrated sort of literary event in comics for the next couple of years. But they were. He essentially arrived with this idea of Swamp Thing being completely different from what everyone had ever previously looked at them as. And whereas there'd always been the idea that Swamp Thing was essentially just a guy who somehow had gotten covered in muck and that there was a man beneath him,
right?
He turns him into sort of this mystical elemental, and he brings in Abby, and suddenly there's a love story for Swamp Thing, and he's got all of the other mystical characters from the DC universe, like Constantine and the Phantom Stranger, sort of wandering around and interacting with him. And this becomes a comic book like really nothing we'd ever seen before in the mainstream.
Really?
So Swamp Thing number 21 he starts with 20, but that's kind of wrapping up the previous storyline. Swamp Thing 21 through probably 35 or so are just some of the most crazy, dense, literate, trippy comic books that you will ever read.
Okay.
And they freaked me out when I was a kid. I was not into these for the first few. I bought them all because I was kind of interested in some of the art and stuff that was going on, because it was him with Bissett and Toddleman. And so they were really interesting looking comic books. But I didn't really get into it for a while. This was another one of those where 15-year-old Dan was still sort of developing those tastes and figuring it out. But this was pretty cool stuff. So, Alan Moore, Swamp Thing, big deal. I also really enjoyed in 1984 that Gene Colan and Don McGregor teamed up for a book called Nathaniel Dusk over at DC. This was the first time that Colan's art, instead of being inked, they actually just colored directly over his pencils. Because his pencils had always been so detailed and so shaded and everything that usually all the inker did was screw it up. Right?
Right.
Like in a best world, the best they could do was sort of, ruin it less by transferring it to ink. And so, but the paper had never been good enough to allow this sort of thing until we got to the direct market. But so those Nathaniel Dusk books are really beautiful and some cool stuff. Other than that, DC had a bunch of other, issues of sort of like landmark issues and stuff like that. But most of the other cool stuff actually happened at Marvel or at some of the other companies. We had some problems in the industry. Badger, Nexus, and Whisper were comics that Capitol was publishing that ended up having to move to First Comics after Capitol collapsed. And in actual fact, Capitol collapsed not because their comic books didn't make money. Evidently, according to the Capitol folks, comics made plenty of money. Their distribution system, which is what Capitol had started being, was run so poorly that it lost hundreds of thousands of dollars and the whole company collapsed. New company called Vortex came out and published Mr. X, which featured art by the Hernandez brothers, among others. Tower Comics rebirthed Thunder Agents. Over in Japan, we saw the debut of a very important series, Dragon Ball Z. No, not Dragon Ball Z. Dragon Ball debuted in Japan in 1984.
Okay.
And so that, of course, starts a franchise probably to rival the Turtles in a lot of ways, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But then the 1,000-pound turtle in the room in this year absolutely is the fact that Mirage Studios, Eastman and Laird, came out with their indie comic, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Number 1 is published. It's got a 3,000 copy print run, sells out immediately, goes into additional reprints. The thing about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is it's a black and white comic. It's self-published. It's got a one-color cover. Like, they only use one color on the cover. So, like, there's green or there's blue or there's orange or whatever. Really low production value comic book. And it's not the right size, which has always ticked me off because my Turtles comics do not fit. They're not magazine-sized and they're not comic book sized. They're in between. So they don't fit with anything else. Right? There should have probably been a new comic bag size created just for Turtles comics. But everybody loved them, and they sold out. And over the next few years, everybody else would look at the fact that it seemed like the Turtles comics were homemade enough that it's like, well, if they can do it, anybody can do it. In their defense, Eastman and Laird were not just a couple of kids making a comic book in their basement. They had experience as professional artists. They had experience with marketing and things like this. There's a reason why their comic book took off the way it did. But what it did in terms of the destruction it wrought upon the industry over the next few years is really astonishing.
Yeah.
That said, man, these were awesome.
We saw and talked about when we went and saw the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, we looked at some of the Eastman and Laird books, as well as some of the, shall I say, inspired by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles books, and the quality difference was definitely pretty noticeable there.
Yep. Still, a lot of that stuff was fun, but it was definitely not the same thing. And it was mostly just that suddenly everybody decided that they could publish a comic book, and the comic stores bought all of it, and a lot of investors bought all of it because the Turtles books immediately just went up in price, right? And
Right.
so suddenly everybody's like, well, I don't want to miss out on the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles,
Yeah.
bonanza. So you just buy everything. And that was not good. But anyways, 1984 really, it's the year of the Turtles. And the changes that the independent publishing arm of the direct market is going to have occurring over the next couple of years as a result of the Turtles. So
That makes
1985, 1986, 1987, you're going to see this really wild ride in terms of independent published black and white, almost zine type of comic books.
Gotcha.
So,
all right. So what about the rest of the industry, or what were some of the industry trends? New companies closing their doors. What did we see in 1984 as far as that goes?
Quite a few of them. We got Antarctic Press debuted, Continuity Comics, which was Neil Adams' company. Essentially, he was publishing through Capital, and then when Capital folded, instead of going with another company like First or something, he just founded his own comic company instead. You got Deluxe Comics came out, Matrix Graphics Series, and also Renegade Press. So a number of different smaller companies. It's also the last year for the Gold Key / Whitman publishing company, which was one of the big companies of the 60s and 70s and 50s and 40s. So Gold Key Whitman have been along a long time.
Sorry. We've been talking about them basically since we started looking at, talking about Murdock and Marvel.
Absolutely.
They've been kind of that 800-pound gorilla for a long time, and it's been drying up for them to the point now that they're in fact closing their doors. Wow.
Yep. So this was the end for them. Capital Comics we talked about, JC Comics, Pacific Comics, and Spectrum all ended this year. And then the only other thing, just as a trend or a thing to note, is that the Cartoon Art Museum opened up this year in San Francisco. The first, as far as I know, American museum dedicated to comic books and comic strips and cartoons. And I have visited there, been there with the family a couple of years ago. It's a really cool place and still exists.
I was going to say that sounds like a lot of fun. I bet there's a lot of really interesting things that you can see there.
Yep, it's a cool place. They regularly change exhibits and the like, but they also have a number of permanent exhibits. Some really, I would assume, a pretty substantial permanent collection of original art, although I'm not sure exactly how much. Probably a few hundred pieces that are on display at any one time, like when we were there. But yeah,
gotcha.
If you're in San Francisco, well worth stopping by and checking it out.
Right. Eagle Awards for 1984. We have those, it looks like, and there's some different names on here than last year. Last year it was kind of the celebration of Marvel. This year it looks a bit more diverse.
Yeah, a lot more diverse. And a lot of creators that we've talked about and that we love. Favorite artist and favorite cover both go to Bill Sienkiewicz, largely for his work transforming the New Mutants. Favorite inker, Terry Austin. Favorite writer, Alan Moore, hops directly in as the favorite writer. Now, these are Eagle Awards, so a lot of the people who are voting for this already knew about Moore because he'd been writing Marvel Man and a bunch of things like that over in England for quite a while. But he won this award largely on the strength of the transformations he made to Swamp Thing. Favorite comic book was Swamp Thing. Favorite character was Reuben Flagg. Favorite supporting character is Roald the Cat, who is Reuben Flagg's cat. So the American Flag book gets some love. Favorite group, Teen Titans. Favorite villain, Doctor Doom. And favorite story was Superman number 400, which was actually a group of stories kind of going through Superman's I guess you'd call it career, or through the years of Superman to celebrate that 400th issue. And the favorite new title, Power Pack, which we're going to be talking about a little later. It's a Marvel title by Louise Simonson.
Nice. All right. So before we jump in and start talking about Marvel, do you want to tell us what your favorite comic was for this year?
So if we're going with all, and I'm kind of going to, even if I had a Marvel as my favorite for the year, I'm going to go with one that's non-Marvel for this because we'll talk the Marvel one later. But
right.
as I kind of hinted last week, New Teen Titans was dominant for me during this time. And this is actually the year of the Terra reveal. It's the year where we really get a chance to see sort of Terra join the New Teen Titans. She's got this, cool romance going with Gar Logan, the Changeling. Everything's going fine. And then we find out that she's some weird cigarette-smoking villain who's like shacking up with Deathstroke, the Terminator, and is in league to destroy the New Teen Titans. And it basically just completely wrecked an entire generation of young men for trusting women, probably. So I have to say that this was bad, but it was a fantastic story, a deeply disturbing story. The older I get, the more the fact that Deathstroke was not only conspiring with, but also sleeping with like a 15 or 16-year-old girl in the book is pretty sketchy. But there you go. This was the era of the Kitty Pryde Colossus romance as well. So I guess those were the time in comics. But and that was not. It was let's just say it was shown to be pretty inappropriate within the Titans comic as well. There was no attempt to make that not as wrong as it is. But great book. Totally messed people up, but it was one of the best stories and one of the best sort of shocking twists of the 80s. By Marv Wolfman and George Perez, by the way.
There you go. So some pretty heavy hitters as far as creators behind that title.
Absolutely.
All right. With that, should we move on and talk about the year at Marvel?
Bring it on.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior.
All right, Dan, we took care of looking outside of Marvel. What does 1984 look like for Marvel? I'm assuming lots and lots and lots going on here because, you don't just start the wheel rolling like they did last year and it just sort of stops.
No, it definitely did not stop. There's so much going on. This year we had an insane number of titles. So 50 new series premiered this year.
Wow.
And in my list of total comic books, I have 112 different titles that were published. Now, some of them are ongoing series, some of them are Marvel graphic novels, some of those are one-shots about, Mother Teresa, some of them are whatever, miniseries. But there were 112 different comic book names that Marvel published during this year. Which is, again, up from that 8 a month that they were publishing back in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So they're making some changes. But I think some of the big things to note, Epic continues to grow. So we're continuing to get some of those Marvel graphic novels coming out. We're continuing to get Epic Illustrated, bringing out some really cool stuff. The Epic comic line itself grows primarily by adding a comic book called Gru, which is by Sergio Aragonés. It's one of my favorite humor comics of all time. And Gru had started actually a while ago. It actually started in the Destroyer Duck benefit book that Steve Gerber was using to try and fund suing Marvel. And, and then there were some Grus published elsewhere, and then he came to Marvel, and now he's actually still publishing it. At like 80-something years old, I am still getting new Gru comic books in my pre-order catalog. He's down to about, I think it's like 7 or 8 a year. But Sergio Aragonés he's literally just a machine. Absolutely amazing.
Like as in today, he is still doing this book? Wow.
Yes.
Holy
There's
cow.
besides Epic Comics, we've got Star Comics created, which is going to be a new imprint for younger readers. I have to admit, I have always been questionable on this. And the more I see it, the more I think that this was a turning point for comics that probably has been bad for us. Is that idea that somehow comic books need to be created for different ages. Because when I was a kid, all comics were for everybody, right?
Right.
And now you have the Epic line for older people. You have the regular line for, say, teens and preteens. And then you have Heathcliff and the Smurfs for, like, I don't know, 5-year-old, like elementary school students or whatever.
Right.
And the problem with that is that the best comics are always the comics that are just a little too old for you. So I don't know, if you're older than like 3, why would you want a Heathcliff comic when you could get Power Pack or, But yeah, so Star Comics essentially ends up having a number of titles over the next while. It's going to be around for a bit, but I don't know it ever really took off. This is going to be, though, essentially Marvel's attempt to find a way to get some of those younger readers back who they've been losing as they move into the direct market and start to focus on sort of darker themes and more inappropriate for young children content.
Gotcha. Okay.
Also, you may have noticed at the start of Daredevil.
Yes. I was
Go
going
ahead.
I was going to ask about Assistant Editors Month because there was a warning as best I could put it on the January issue of Daredevil, basically just saying we're letting the assistants run the show this month. Be prepared for anything. It was basically kind of the messaging on the title.
Yeah, and I think it was, first off, it was essentially a set piece, right? This is something that Shooter and everybody else planned out.
Uh-huh.
All of the stories were edited by the regular people and everything else, or at least approved by them. So there was nothing that was actually the inmates take over the asylum about this. But what they did is essentially let everybody just do some goofy things that month to give people kind of a palate cleanser of sort of some just interesting things. John Byrne took advantage of this to have 6 whiteout pages. There was a character called Snowbird in Alpha Flight, and there was a fight or a scene where somehow she turned everything into a blizzard, and you had kind of that polar bear in a blizzard type of thing, where
Sure.
things were going on, but all you had was word bubbles because you couldn't see anything because of the snowstorm.
Right.
Which made life easy for him, considering he's penciling and inking 2 books now or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Aunt May actually became the Herald of Galactus in a Spider-Man story.
Of course.
She was called Golden Oldie. This was in Marvel Team Up. It says the crazy thing, or the end of it, was actually that she saved the day, essentially saved the planet, by feeding Galactus a giant Twinkie instead of him eating the Earth.
Oh,
she got
my
this
goodness.
Twinkie, who really knows? The Avengers appeared on Letterman in the Avengers comic book. So you've got David Letterman on the cover of the Avengers. And there was one story called The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man that was not actually a funny story. It was, in many cases, it's been called one of the best Spider-Man stories of all time. And it's a story, if you haven't read this, you could skip this and go ahead and read that Spider-Man story because it's awesome. But in essence, it's a story where Spider-Man goes to visit a kid who's known as sort of his biggest fan and somebody who's been collecting clippings of him for years. And he goes and he hangs out and he talks to the kid and eventually ends up even telling the kid his secret identity and a lot of his backstory, his secret backstory about why he became Spider-Man. And as he's leaving, the kid's like, I'll never tell anybody. I'll keep your secret as long as I live. And Spider-Man's like, yeah, I know. And then as he leaves, you can see it's a cancer ward. And it's implied that obviously the little guy does not have much longer to live.
Man.
So it is a kind of a gut punch type of a story.
Yeah.
But it's also a really good story. I always liked that one. I went back and read it, in fact, this week in preparation for the podcast, and it still hits pretty hard, even 30 years later. So,
yeah, there was a special, like, smaller secondary story in this issue for Daredevil that had, like, these kids in a classroom, and one of them, like, thought they saw Daredevil outside or was being accused of being Daredevil, and it was just, yeah, it was just sort of weird, and like, not knowing exactly what I was supposed to get out of Assistant Editors Month. It would just sort of seemed like, okay, here's one of those, like, secondary stories from the time when we had these books that had, like, this, you know, a second story in them, and it just was like 6 pages, maybe 8 pages, and then it was sort of done. It didn't really have any continuity with anything that was going on or anything at all.
Yep. Yeah, that is correct. It did have your man Turk in it. I remember you used to be a fan of Turk appearing.
Yes.
He's the guy that crashes in through the class window. So
Right.
But yeah, so that was a little bit weird, but they did their thing there. We had J.M. DeMatteis trying to kill Steve Rogers. He'd been on Captain America on a long run, and at the end of the run, his final story arc, ending with number 300, was going to, and this is, he plotted this all out, got it approved by his editor, and sent it to Shooter, who then said, no way in hell I'm letting you do this.
On this?
But he had planned to have Steve Rogers start to question his vigilante justice, give up the Spider-Man, or give up the Captain America mantle, and then be assassinated, and someone else comes in and takes over the Captain America role.
Whoa!
But so he's not only killed, but before he's killed, he questions the entire sort of, you know, vigilante justice system that the Marvel Universe and all of its superhero characters is based on.
Yeah, that, I can't imagine why Jim Shooter would put the brakes on that.
And again, I have to turn my little Shooter dial back up a little ways, because he did at least prevent this. There's a bunch of reprints that happened this year, including Elektra Saga. Elektra Saga actually reprints the Frank Miller stories that we just read like 2 weeks ago.
So okay.
They were popular enough, and Marvel didn't really have a process for second printings and things like this of regular books that often. And I don't know that they realized it until it had gone a bit, just how popular these books were going to be. So they actually did reprints on better paper of 4 of the stories, 4 of the key stories from the Elektra arc that Miller and Jansen had done. And they sold really well. They also reprinted a bunch of other, like Doctor Strange, Captain America things in these special editions. And we got Phoenix the Untold Story, which is an interesting book, because if you remember when we talked about how Jean Grey died during the Dark Phoenix saga, there had been the plan originally for her to survive and lose her powers. And this was another of those that Shooter's like, nope, she literally killed 6 billion people. You can't just slap her on the wrist. She's going to have to pay the big price. And so they rewrote it and they killed her. But that story was already pretty much done. And so they printed this out of continuity story showing how it would have looked if they'd gone with Claremont and Byrne's original idea, where essentially Jean Grey lives, loses her powers, and sort of goes off to continue on. And so that was interesting. It also had some like articles and the like, talking with Claremont and Byrne about what they'd planned going forward and that sort of thing. So, bunch of things like that. But as much as the rest of the comics world was dominated by the Turtles in 1984, Marvel was dominated by something called Secret Wars.
Oh, yes.
Secret Wars blew up the Marvel Universe in 1984. And so what happened here, we'd seen a couple of these sort of maxi series. For instance, like Camelot 3000, which was 12 issues by DC a couple of years ago. Well, this is the first time Marvel tries this. And what they did is they actually partnered with a toy company, I think it's Kenner, to, maybe it's Hasbro, I can't remember. That company did not get the DC license for superhero toys. So they wanted to get the Marvel license just in case superhero toys became the next Star Wars action figure, because Star Wars action figures made billions of dollars. Right?
Blowing up, yeah.
So they're now like, well, we don't want to miss out if this one is. So they talked to Marvel, they got the license, but as part of that, they said one thing we need is some sort of comic book event that we can tie our figures and their launch to. So Shooter came up with this idea of a big battle between all of the characters in sort of this Secret Wars. Once that had been agreed on, he's like, I got to have somebody to write it. And he couldn't figure out which of his people was going to write it. Because he's like, if I give it to anybody, they're going to be mad because, or everybody else is going to be mad because someone else is writing their characters. If I give it to somebody who's, writing Avengers, then Byrne's going to be mad because suddenly his Fantastic Four characters are being used in something he doesn't have any control over. So he's like, what I need is somebody who's got experience writing tons of characters, big groups of characters, somebody who knows the current state of the entire Marvel Universe really well, and somebody who's not going to get yelled at by everybody when writing the story. He's like, there's only one man for this job.
I was going to say, this doesn't seem like this is going to be a long list of people.
He's like, there's only one man for this job, and his name's Jim Shooter. And so...
Oh, God.
He assigns himself writing duties, which, to be quite frank, he did. I mean, he wrote the Legion of Superheroes when he was 13 years old, so he's got an impeccable biography in terms of all the things he was saying was right. But it did also allow him to, get royalties off of the biggest selling comic book of the year for Marvel. So, nicely done, Shooter.
Yeah.
But so he writes this. And what they did actually is at the end of April, or at the end of the March issues, you had a number of the characters from the Marvel Universe sort of disappearing into this gate. And then the next issue, when they come back in April, fundamental things have changed, because it turns out those characters have been away for a year. Now, in universe time, not much time has passed at all. But so they go into this weird battle world out with the Beyonder, where they spend like basically a year fighting each other, heroes against villains, for the fate of the universe and everything. And then when they come back, Spider-Man reappears in April with a black costume. The Thing is gone from the Fantastic Four because he decides that since he can change back to Ben Grimm at will when he's in this other universe, he's going to stay there for a while. And Jennifer Walters, the She-Hulk, takes over as the fourth member of the Fantastic Four. All these changes happen, though, and we don't know why. Because in April, when Spider-Man comes back with his black costume, we also get Secret Wars #1, where Spider-Man appears in the Beyonder, battle universe in his regular costume. And it's going to be a number of issues before he gets the black costume in that universe. So for an entire year, we know things have happened, but we don't know why.
Yeah, you're playing
and it's kind of fascinating. Yeah. So a lot of people now talk about this as a beloved series, right? And it did change the game for Marvel in a lot of ways. We had then Secret Wars 2 and all sorts of things immediately. A lot of fans at the time hated it because it did mess with things. And to be quite frank, the story wasn't probably great, right?
Okay.
It was fine if you're trying to make a story to sell toys, right? But it wasn't a really great story necessarily. That said, somebody asked Carol Kalish, who's the direct sales manager for Marvel, about it. So she said, let's be honest, Secret Wars was crap, right? But did it sell? And the answer to that was a massive yes. So it was by far their biggest selling title of the year.
Sure.
So, yeah. So we get Spidey's black costume out of this. Kitty and Colossus break up during the Secret Wars. So when X-Men comes back in that April issue, you don't know exactly why, but you know that Kitty's, experiencing things, which drives her off into the Kitty and Wolverine miniseries, which is probably one of the most disappointing and terrible miniseries in the history of miniseries, and etc. So it's also when she becomes Shadowcat and everything. But there is a book, by the way, Box Brown's He-Man Effect, which I think is very interesting in contextualizing this, because it talks about how in the 80s toy companies and television animation and everything else sort of colluded to package and sell us our childhood. And my generation, and then I think yours even more so, Dwayne, were directly sort of the subject / victim of this process. So
yeah, okay.
So definitely makes a person angry.
Interesting. We'll briefly touch on the fact that there was a Daredevil issue that seemed remarkably weird, and it featured the Beyonder in it that, to be perfectly frank, I had no idea what was going on. It made no sense.
Yep. That is what was happening back then. There was a lot of this doesn't make any sense going on. The Beyonder also was just a weird character. He looked sort of like some sort of David Hasselhoff in a weird white ski jacket or something like this. And somehow he's supposed to be the greatest power in the universe. And so Galactus he was not. But in any case, that's how that goes.
All right, so let's dive into the new series that you were talking about. You said something like 50 new series in 1984?
Yes. We are not going to talk about all of them, but there are a bunch of them. That said, there are only about 7 actual new series that stuck around. Power Pack by Louise Simonson was a new group of characters, essentially a family of kids that are given powers by a dying alien to help them defend their planet. That went 62 issues, and the Power Pack kids have continued to be a big part of the Fantastic Four storyline and other parts of the Marvel Universe for decades. Conan the King debuted, went 36 issues. That's sort of those tales of Conan when he's a little older and has actually been taken on the role of king in a kingdom someplace in the Hyborian Age. Doctor Who went 23 issues. This was the Tom Baker Doctor, the Scarf Doctor.
Gotcha.
Those were actually pretty good. I, in fact, had not watched Doctor Who, so my first experience with Doctor Who was the comics, not the shows.
Makes sense.
Alien Legion was probably one of my favorite books that debuted this year. It's a science fiction war book. Frank Sirocco did the art on it. It's absolutely amazing. That went 20 issues. And then also Micronauts New Voyages went 20 issues. This started essentially a month or two after the end of the first Micronauts series. At the end of that one, the planet called Homeworld, which was sort of the home of the Micronauts, was destroyed by Baron Karza, who's kind of a cut-rate Darth Vader type of bad guy for the Micronauts universe. And then the New Voyages is them sort of off looking for new adventures now that their home has been destroyed. That went 20 issues. Time Spirits was an epic book that went 8. And Amazing High Adventure was another epic book that went 5. So we had a few of them. There was also a ton of miniseries. Again, I'm not going to go over them, but I think it's like 20 some. The ones I think are worth taking a look at are Hercules. The second Hercules miniseries was fantastic. Jack of Hearts miniseries I really liked. The Six from Sirius was an epic series with Doug Mensch that was really well made. X-Men and Micronauts was a messed up series that I think there are essays to be written about the things that Professor X tried in that. Kitty and Wolverine was actually, I think, popular. I didn't like it, partly because I didn't like the art. Last Starfighter was fun because, of course, I love the Last Starfighter movie. So this is the comic adaptation.
Okay.
Machine Man had a 4-issue miniseries that was probably one of the more beautiful comic books of the year, which is a little bit crazy because it had, I think, Herb Trumpy or something art. But it's amazing when you get one of the best artists of all time to ink your stuff, how good it looks. Because Barry Windsor Smith was the inker on this, and he just lifted it completely. Fantastic stuff. And then there was a West Coast Avengers mini that turned into an actual full series a year or two later.
Interesting. So, some different stuff throughout all of that. I can honestly say I don't think I've heard of any of these.
No.
With the exception of, like, I recognize The Last Starfighter because of the movie. So that makes sense.
So we also have two that I'll call oddities that don't really fit as regular series or miniseries or whatever.
I was going to ask you what these were, because, yeah, what are these?
So Transformers, relatively easy. That's the Transformers, right?
Yes.
Autobots and Decepticons debuted in the Marvel Universe this year. This is another one of those toy licenses that Marvel had put together. And it was intended as a 5-issue miniseries because they just were going to do this, and nobody knew if anybody would actually buy any of these Transformer toys or whatever, right? Well, it turns out they did. And people liked the stories, too, because you had the TV show, you had the comics, you had everything. This ended up going 80 issues. So they did a 5-issue miniseries. And if you look at the front covers of the books, the first 2 or 3 say, you know, miniseries issue 1 of 5, issue 2 of 5, issue 3 of 5. And then there's a couple where it's just sort of like there's nothing there. And then issue 6 comes out and they just don't mention it anymore. And it went for 80 issues. So it just trucked on. Very, very successful miniseries. One of the longest limited series in Marvel history, I guess you'd have to call it. So
I would think that's so funny. It's like, you're like expecting this to be the last issue, and then suddenly you get there and it's like, no, this isn't the last issue. We're just gonna keep going and see if anyone notices. And nope, we're just gonna keep going.
Yeah, nobody complained. But I think the other nice thing was that it looks like they knew early enough on the sales that this was really popular, because there were actual reprints of the Transformers #1 and the like, that they're like, all right, let's, 5 wasn't like the end of the storyline and then 6 just appears. They just had, by the time 5 came out, they had already, or was produced, they knew they were making 6, and it just worked like a regular series. But it is still weird that the first couple issues implied it was going to end, and it didn't. And then we have another odd situation. Over the last few years, we've kind of been talking about how, the undergrounds went away, so we don't really have those after some of those pornography verdicts and stuff like that. In the early 80s, you had independent books, and they did some stuff where there was more sex and there was more violence and whatever. And then we got Valmy Eric's Void Indigo, which had such over-the-top content. It was a graphic novel, a Marvel graphic novel, that then rolled into a 6-issue limited series. And by the time you got to the second issue of the miniseries, really the first issue, the level of sex and just really gory violence was so bad that distributors were demanding to be able to return the book. Because they're like, look, Marvel told us mature content. They didn't tell us it was this. Canada actually refused to let the book come into the country, or at the very least, they confiscated at least one copy of Void Indigo and went to the courts to start trying to determine whether or not this comic book was allowable under Canada's obscenity and pornography laws.
Wow.
At which point, not only did it have poor sales, the distributors that Marvel depended on now were angry at them for the fact that they'd sent them this stuff. And they might be in trouble with Canada and nobody wants to be in trouble with Canada. So
Sure.
they just canceled it. As far as I know, this is the only series labeled as a miniseries by Marvel that has not gone at least close to the number of issues it's supposed to. So if something's they're like, oh, we're doing a miniseries, 4-issue miniseries. Well, they're going to do the 4 issues because when it started, you know the full slate of what the story is going to be, and they just commit to publishing that because otherwise, it's one of the reasons people buy miniseries is you're going to get a complete story in a certain amount of time.
Right.
I have seen where a 5-issue miniseries ends up turning into a 4-issue miniseries, or where a 6-issue miniseries turns into an 8-issue miniseries. But as far as I know, this is the first time, the only time Marvel has ever had a miniseries they just abandon and go, this is a potato that is too hot to handle. We're just giving up.
Sure.
And so, yeah, Void Indigo may have been a tipping point also in terms of the way the direct market works. Because I think it showed, at least at that point, that there was a limit in terms of what people could do even when they sent it to the direct market, where you didn't have to worry about the Comics Code Authority. You still had to worry about the guy who is selling your comic books and maybe, some sorts of community censorship if you go too far. And nobody wanted to go back to that.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. All right, well, with all of these new titles, does that mean that we had like a glut of new characters that we had throughout all this?
We did, although kind of like you noted, there weren't a lot that you remember. So I'm not like including Buckaroo Banzai, as because we never saw him after the Buckaroo Banzai movie adaptation or whatever. In terms of characters who mattered, we got the Beyonder, who's going to keep coming back and causing trouble as one of these, cosmic powered beings. We got the group of Power Pack kids and their parents, Alex, Jack, James, Julie, Katie, and Margaret. We got the Transformers, all those Autobots, all those Decepticons. Again, not going to name them all. You know them, right? Nathaniel Richards made his debut in Fantastic Four. He's Reed's dad and becomes very important. This is where we start to get that idea of the Richards lineage being sort of this, group of geniuses, one after another, going through history. And so not only is Reed impressive, but his dad is sort of this weird galactic power, and his son is going to become one of the most powerful mutants in the history of the world, with basically the ability to rewrite reality however he happens to want to. So you don't mess with the Richards kids. And his daughter is also going to be insanely powerful. So, and then we got Terminus in Fantastic Four as well. Mother Sin, or Mother Superior, also known sometimes as Sin, debuted in Captain America. Titania, who's going to be a She-Hulk villain, debuted during the Secret Wars. And then, as usual, we get a billion X people. We get Lila Cheney, who's this rock star. She's kind of like a raven-haired Dazzler to a certain extent. We get Forge, we get Leech, we get Magus, Ogun, Warlock, Warpath. We get the Hellions, including Cat's Eye, Empath, Jetstream, Roulette, Terrell, and Thunderbird. So a bunch of those are out of New Mutants. And then probably outside of that, the most important, not necessarily character at this point, but going to be character, thing that we saw is the alien symbiote black costume, which originally was a costume redesign that was sent in by a kid. Somebody who was like, hey, it'd be cool if Spider-Man had this black costume. And they bought the costume from him, tried to develop it into a story, didn't get it to work, brought it back, I think for like $200 or something, brought it back during Secret Wars, and then it turned into essentially this symbiote that had attached itself to Peter Parker and eventually turns into Venom.
Oh, okay.
So this is the genesis of Venom. But he's not Venom this year. That's still coming.
All right. Some names I recognize there throughout that list. That definitely,
Yep.
yeah. Some characters that we'll see, I guess. What about books that ended this year?
Well, you're going to have to pour one out, my friend, because this is a sad year for us. Micronauts went 59 issues and then ended, and immediately got a reboot. So it really didn't end. It just sort of
sure.
did sort of the kind of start that we see all the time now, where they end Daredevil, and then 2 months later you get a new Daredevil #1. So, but Micronauts Volume 1 ended. What If ended at 47 issues. And our man Moon Knight had his first cancellation. He went 38 issues and ended this year. So that was sad. Kazar the Savage had gone 34 issues, the last few of them as a direct-only title, kind of like Moonlight was. Official Handbook of the Marvel Universe went 15. That was actually planned, essentially. They had to figure out how many to get all the stuff done. And then US1 somehow managed 12 issues. 12 terrible, terrible issues. So, but yeah, the interesting... But one thing to note about the ones that ended is Micronauts, Moon Knight, and Kazar the Savage, all direct market titles. Meaning that while the direct market is doing well, it is a little weird that they had 3 of their titles that were some of their flagship direct market titles all end in the same year here. So
interesting. Yeah, okay. All right, so I have to imagine that means with all these new titles and everything that's going on, that the bullpen is huge.
Yep, over 300 people. And I'm being more careful now about how I find things to try and make sure that I'm not bringing in reprints and old stuff and everything else. So I'm not getting a bunch of Jack Kirby and Steranko and whatever. The staff size is 303. Editor-in-chief is still Jim Shooter. Our top creators for the year, Bill Mantlo, John Byrne, and Chris Claremont, leading writers. John Byrne, Al Milgram, and Sal Buscema, leading pencilers. Inker, John Byrne, Danny Belandi, and Joe Sinnott. So with his 2 titles, Alpha Flight and Fantastic Four, which he writes, pencils, and inks himself every month, John Byrne is a leader in all categories.
He's doing a lot of work.
Yep. He is at a maybe not quite a Jack Kirby level of effort, but not that terribly far off. As far as colorist, we have Bob Sharon, George Roussos, and Christy Scheel. Letterer, Joe Rosen, Janice Chang, and Rick Parker. So, number of people we've seen before and the like, but there are a few new folks making their way up. Danny Belandi, I don't think we've seen at the top for inking. Rick Parker, I don't think we've seen up there for lettering. So, and then as far as a couple of other just things to note, sad time for Marvel in that Sal Brodsky, who was the Marvel production manager, basically from the beginning of the Marvel age up through, the years, he died this year. He was Stan Lee's right-hand man for most of the 60s. So when they did the Fantastic Four What If issue, where Stan Lee and Jack Kirby actually were on the thing and turned into the Fantastic Four, Brodsky was one of the other ones with them as well. But he's probably one of the most important sort of lesser-known people in the history of the Marvel Universe in terms of getting things done and being key. And then Phil Seuling we should maybe mention, because he was important to Marvel because as the sort of the father of the direct market, when he founded Seagate back in the day and then started doing direct marketing, he was kind of the one that led the way for the direct market era of comics. And he passed away in 1984 as well.
Oh, that's sad that we have some memorials this year. Let's look at the Rookie of the Year. Who are the new folks that came in, and who gets the Rookie of the Year for 1984?
So there's a number of people who came in. I'm just going to focus on 5 names, a few of them just briefly. Frank Sirocco did his first work for Marvel this year. Absolutely brilliant artist, but he didn't actually do that many comics. He worked in a lot of other forms, started his own studio, that sort of thing. but he did co-create Alien Legion this year. He later on did covers for Defenders and a bunch of others that I think are some of the coolest covers of the 1980s for Marvel. Really, he just didn't do that much work either for Marvel or for comics in general, though, in terms of being a Rookie of the Year. Tom Yates, most famous really as the artist for Prince Valiant and Zorro comic strips, but he did also work a bit for Marvel. His art was really, really very impressive. I liked Yates' stuff, but again, he worked more in comic strips than comic books. Mark Teixeira worked on Ghost Rider, Moon Knight, and other books. He also was a skilled painter. He is somebody who, when he came in, was kind of labeled as sort of a Neil Adams clone. He then worked his way into more of his own style as he improved, kind of like Bill Sienkiewicz did. Again, just didn't do as much stuff as some people. There was a Moon Knight miniseries that we read with Teixeira art that I really like, and I think you enjoyed that one too.
Right.
Outside of that, there are two people I think who have a real good case. The first is a guy we mentioned a little earlier, Sergio Aragonés. Everything he did for Marvel pretty much was Gru the Wanderer for Epic. So he just had the one title, but it did go for a long time, like 50, 60 issues. And Gru is a title that a lot of people really enjoyed, and it sort of served a market within Marvel that nobody else did. That said, he is most famous for 50 years of working on Mad Magazine and the likes. If you ever remember with old Mads, there would be like little cartoons in the margins and stuff. A lot of those were Sergio Aragonés.
Okay.
And he also did all sorts of the actual stories for them and everything else. As a cartoonist, he is almost beyond parallel. And in fact, he's not only in the Eisner Hall of Fame as of 2002, but the actual comic artists sort of society named its cartooning award, essentially their version of the Eisner, is named the Sergio.
Oh, okay.
So he's not only in a Hall of Fame, there's a Hall of Fame named after him. So
that's a pretty good accolade there.
So he is really incomparable. But his body of work is magnificent, but it's not in Marvel. He's really just got that one book. And even when you think Gru the Wanderer started someplace else. It was like with Pacific and the like. Now it's getting published by Dark Horse. So even his core character doesn't really associate directly to Marvel. I think the guy I'm going to go with, and this is again somebody who didn't do a ton of stuff, but Arthur Adams debuted this year. First thing he really does that's important for Marvel is he co-creates Longshot. Does this along with writer Ann Nocenti, who'd been an editor for a while. This was really Nocenti's sort of first big writing project. She's, of course, going to go on to do a lot of the Daredevil stuff we're going to be looking at here. You may, in fact, if you're reading ahead, already be into some of the Nocenti books. I'm not sure. But yes, no?
Read one book with Anderson.
Just getting started with them. Perfect. So I think you're going to enjoy a lot of those. She has a nice run on the series. But Adam's style from the very beginning was just astonishingly energetic and kind of infectious. He ends up drawing another book called he ends up drawing another series. It's referred to as the Asgardian Wars, which has, among other things, sort of Storm in a big Thor helmet and stuff like this. He did tons of covers, work on the X books and the like. And I think the reason why, above all else, he is the guy I would choose as the Rookie of the Year is when Marvel did its Heroes for Hope book, he's the one that does the cover. There's a Wolverine standee that's sent out to comic stores, drawn by Arthur Adams. In many ways, his style informs Jim Lee and McFarlane and all these guys that come after. And really, when I think of 1980s Marvel, in my head, it's an Arthur Adams drawing almost.
Ah, right? Okay. That makes sense.
Even though he didn't do that much, he's got kind of this very interesting style that is just so important for future artists and the like, and it was so key to this time that I think he's a perfectly good I think he's a good choice as a Rookie of the Year and one of my favorite artists. So
that does sound like a great choice for Rookie of the Year. So congratulations to Arthur Adams for winning 1984's Rookie of the Year. Dan, one more thing before we start talking about our man Daredevil. What, as far as Marvel comics go, were your favorites from this year?
So I apologize for this, but I loved Secret Wars when I was 15. It was everywhere. I had not seen one of these sorts of big team ups before. Really, nobody had, because this is sort of the first time it had been tried. I enjoyed the heck out of it, and so I apologize for that now because I've reread it and I know it's not good. But when I was a kid, I thought it was a lot of fun. I also loved John Byrne's Alpha Flight and the Hercules miniseries, the Machine Man miniseries, and the Jack of Hearts miniseries, which were drawn by Layton, was Hercules, Windsor Smith on Machine Man, and George Freeman on Jack of Hearts, were all fantastic.
All right, sounds like... So is Secret Wars kind of the first big, like, crossover, huge, like, universe story? And
there had never been anything like it before.
Okay.
Not even close. DC had been doing, like, Justice League, Justice Society crossovers every year for a while. You'd occasionally have some characters go into another character's book. We had the Contest of Champions, which was a 3-issue miniseries a couple of years before, which sort of did on a small scale what Secret Wars did. But no, not really. Because even Contest of Champions was more like a pocket. It didn't seep back into the main continuity and sort of just take over the universe the way that a lot of the modern crossovers do.
I was going to say, so this is kind of that first thing that ends up being like Devil's Reign or like the current Blood Hunt that is going on in Marvel currently. The first seed of that sort of big, massive crossover that affects the entire universe, that has like stories separate from your main story. And you have a main story, and then there's like bits in all the individual like character books as well, right?
Yes. And don't expect this to just be Marvel for very long either, because DC's about to say, hold my beer in 1985. And
okay.
The Crisis on Infinite Earths is going to basically wipe away the entire DC universe while affecting everything. So DC saw what they did and then immediately upped the ante substantially. But between the two of them, Secret Wars and Crisis set the tone for these big summer crossovers that basically are, ubiquitous for both of the companies from this point forward.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. I think we got a handle on what is going on in comics. I think we've got a handle at what's going on now at Marvel. So I think it's time to talk about our man, Matt Murdock.
Bring it on.
The year in Daredevil.
All right, Dwayne. So, talked about everything else. Now it's time to get down to Daredevil. Tell us a little bit about what he's been up to this year, where he's been off to, and a little bit about who's been working on him.
Yeah, there's a lot that happens this year as far as appearances for our man Matt Murdock and Daredevil. In his main series, we're going to be looking at issues 202 to 213, but he also has appearances in The Incredible Hulk, number 291 and 293. He's in Defenders, 127. He's in Spider-Man and Daredevil Special Edition, number 1, a Marvel team-up book, number 140 and 141. He's in that Elektra Saga, the reprint book that you mentioned earlier, issues 3 and 4, and Marvel Age number 17. As far as creators, on Daredevil this year, there's a lot of people that actually end up working on Daredevil this year. Denny O'Neil probably has the most number of credits this year. He's starts off the year and then has a couple multi-issue runs later on. You have Stephen Grant, Harlan Ellison, and Arthur Byron Cover do an issue, and then Byron Cover takes over the following issue. And then towards the end of the year, we get Denny O'Neil back with David Mazzucchelli, who ends up being kind of the primary, I would say, penciler this year. He comes in at issue 206, and then 208 through 213 through the end of the year. He actually is the penciler for the Daredevil run. William Johnson and Jeff Isherwood and Luke McDonnell are the other ones that had penciler credit this year. And then Danny Belandi has a number of inks this year. Actually, inked all. And he had some help from Mel Canado and Pat Redding for 2 issues throughout the year as well. But so there's a lot of change throughout this year, and it does sort of feel like that when you're looking at the stories. However, this year starts and ends with one sort of villain, I would say, and it is Micah Sin. He's the chief of an East African Kilgore tribe who are also descendants of British explorers who have been isolated until very recently. Sin has 2 wives and a group of other followers who travel to the United States and suddenly kind of get this like fame status. Almost like reality TV sort of fame status. Everybody's excited. They want to meet him.
Yep.
Want to know what's going on with him, want to see him in the news, all this sort of thing. And so many of the books this year chronicle Sin turning from a media darling to a wanted criminal, hunted not just by Daredevil, but also the Kingpin as well. So talk about somebody that kind of runs the gambit throughout the year to end up being in a situation where Daredevil and Kingpin actually team up to try and take down this character during the year. It is actually quite something. Yeah,
it's interesting. If you're not used to him and you've read other comics, but maybe not the Daredevil stuff or seen some of the DC things that feature him, he's kind of a Vandal Savage type of character. Somebody who's got that. He's a white guy who is supposedly, and I guess also a Khazar, because he's got a, as you'll talk about, I'm sure in a while, he's got a relative who wants to kill him because he's like, this guy is uncivilized and he's not worthy of the Sin name or whatever. And so it's a little bit strange, but basically, like British explorers or the like went over, got lost, got separated, and now you've got this entire tribe that's been living in these what the book calls savage conditions, where there's no mercy and the like for all these years. And now they come to America, and he's got this inability to basically feel compassion for anyone, it seems. He just takes what he wants, and he hurts who he wants, and away he goes.
It's a really weird character, and like it's something that like it's not entirely unexpected, I guess. The way they're introduced, that very first issue, we see this Horatio Piper, this professor is kind of has this group in tow with him. He introduces them to Nelson and Murdock because basically they need some help with some legal documents. And that's the whole premise on how they meet. You have, to your point, they go and they just start stealing food. One of the wives walks in front of a car and gets hit by a car. And so they end up having to go to a hospital because they don't know. They don't know what civilized sort of society, I guess, is, which is, I guess, New York in the near mid 80s. And, he beats up a cop. There's just all sorts of really rough stuff. So you could tell right away that this character is going to end up being bad before this is all said and done. And this is probably somebody that Daredevil's going to have to deal with. But it's just weird because like the way the year sort of goes, because we had all these different creators on the books, specifically from a writing standpoint, the story sort of weaves in and out of that character. We have issues where we're seeing what's going on with this character, and you're having continuation of this story. And then like the very next month, you have this story where we get introduced to a new foe called the Trump. And one of Daredevil's childhood bullies is like accused of helping this guy steal a shipment of weapons. And so it is really sort of weird how it just kind of goes ebbs and flows back and forth between just what seemed like almost random stories and then this more coherent narratives, longer, bigger story with Micah Sin. Dan, when you looked at these books, did you notice that? Am I completely off base in this?
No, you're 100% on. This is no way to run a comic book, right? It's difficult to keep track of things. There is a point where I think it's kind of cool when a book is set up so that you've got a character, a villain who simmers over the course of a year and is always just sort of in the background. But usually when that happens, the story builds with a couple of pages of them every month where you still see what they're up to. What'll happen here is the main plot line just disappears for a while and it veers off somewhere else. And then it comes back when the people who were interested in that return. And so I am not impressed by this year's Daredevils for the most part. This is a rough time for Daredevil because this is the interregnum. It's the time between when Miller leaves the first time and when Miller comes back.
Yeah.
And it's not great. And part of that is they don't have regulars. I also will say part of it is that David Mazzucchelli is in many ways the regular penciler. He's not the David Mazzucchelli that you think of when you think of David Mazzucchelli. I don't know if you noticed, but does this art look different than the art you see like a year or so from now when you're reading the Born Again storyline?
It does look different. It doesn't feel as sort of like crisp or like it has a different feel to it, I guess is the best way of putting it. It doesn't feel as dark as it ends up feeling once you get into when Frank Miller returns and they're working on Born Again.
Yeah, as weird as it is, I think that Mazzucchelli at this point is a decent draftsman, but he has not really mastered storytelling. And a lot of these, to me, the storytelling is maybe clear enough, but it's relatively boring. And Mazzucchelli's, once he hits his stride, his stuff is not boring at all. He is a fantastically, emotional storyteller. And so I just think this, it's weird. I have to remind myself all the time that this is Mazzucchelli art because it doesn't look like it to me.
So this is kind of some of my first introduction to David Mazzucchelli. And I will tell you, I think the art looks good. It looks fine. I definitely, I don't have any issues with, understanding what's going on. I don't confuse characters. The action scenes look good. And so, all the kind of pieces are there. It's just this, I think the story actually pulls the images down a little bit. There's just, the story is not pulling me in enough to make me really care what it looks like, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah. I went in to look now, for instance, just at issue 231, which is Miller and Mazzucchelli. And the artwork just looks entirely different. And now part of that is that obviously I think Miller is sending some sort of layouts and things like this because there are some elements there. But the finished art, the style, everything about it looks completely different. And when I think of Daredevil and Mazzucchelli, I think of the Born Again stuff, which is why
Sure.
this is just strange. So it seems wispy and sort of, I don't want to use the word lightweight, but it doesn't have the weight that Mazzucchelli's art has later on.
Sure. Okay.
So, yeah.
That makes sense. So to your point, we keep kind of flopping back and forth. We go back to the Micah Sin story. You mentioned the assassination attempt by a family member that wants to get him out of the way so that he can take over as chief because he's not civilized. We see the other weird thing about this story is Debbie Harris, Foggy Nelson's wife, who was abducted. They had this long time where she was missing, ends up getting saved by Daredevil, and ultimately get back together with Foggy. They get married. Debbie Harris, like, immediately becomes infatuated with Micah Sin. And
Yes.
that felt weird. And only
Very
gets
weird.
weirder as the year goes on.
Yes.
And so
Weird is a generous term for it, I would have to say.
Yeah, it was it was something. So you have this assassination attempt again. Just ran another step away from that, and we actually meet a what I'm thinking is a pretty important character, Gloriana O'Brien, who is Debbie Harris's niece from Ireland, who is in New York over concerns that she is in danger after her father is killed, which turns out actually to be completely true. Daredevil ends up saving her from being abducted and then saves her from a friend of her father's who turns out to be the killer called the Gale, who is like an enforcer for the IRA. This character...
Yes.
Immediately starts to seem like a love interest because apparently every new woman that gets brought into a Daredevil title must be a love interest for Daredevil or Matt Murdock.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how that happens, but he's mourned Elektra long enough, so it's time to get moving. It's been months, man.
I guess.
We even had a little bit of Black Widow in amongst all of this returning, so yeah, insane.
So even though we're at like the middle of the year as far as books go, there's a Christmas party that Matt Murdock is throwing at his house. There's a stolen kiss between Micah Sin and Debbie Harris, and another battle with Daredevil and Sin that actually ends up getting ended in part by the Kingpin, who happens to be strolling along outside Matt Murdock's house just as they happen to be outside, may take their fight outside. So again, it just so weird, this sort of back and forth throughout all this. And again, this thing with Debbie Harris and Micah Sin just immediately ratchets up even more.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure that it looks like the writers really knew what to do with Foggy and her and whatever, and so they've kind of got this as a way of now starting to make that all go on the outs.
Sure. So next we actually get like about a 3-book story break from this main story. The first, we have Daredevil must find a Russian defector and a stolen microchip for Hydra in order to save a captured Black Widow. Daredevil finds the defector but not the chip, and instead saves Widow without it, and the pair then take down some Hydra agents who have captured her. We also have immediately after that, we have Daredevil stumbling into a murder house trap set by the mother of a former villain. I felt like this story was really unique, and so this is actually going to be our spotlight story for the week. So give me a few minutes, but we will get back to the murder house trap in our spotlight story.
Excellent.
So back to Micah Sin, he files a restraining order against Daredevil, and his men have a run-in with the Kingpin, which then causes a battle between Sin and Daredevil, and Sin then learns that Murdock's secret identity. And it's so weird because he basically smells Matt Murdock's coat or scarf, and he's just like, well, I've been fighting this guy a bunch, and this thing smells the same as the guy I've been fighting, so they're obviously the same person. So we now have somebody else that knows Matt Murdock's secret identity.
Yeah, that was weird.
Yeah, from that, it really starts to ramp up pretty fast. We have Micah capturing Becky. That is Becky Blake, the secretary, the handicapped secretary for Nelson and Murdock, as well as Vanessa Fisk, in this case, Kingpin's wife, for a human sacrifice to his god. Daredevil intervenes, but Vanessa is killed, except she wasn't, because we find out that Kingpin has hired an actress to play Vanessa as a way to keep his wife, Vanessa, safe.
Yes. Because
of this, Daredevil and Kingpin team up with the idea of taking down Micah Sin. So we get this break, and then we come back, and he finds out the identity, and it immediately ratchets up the tension, and we just have this snowball effect of things that happen as we go towards the end of the year. I will say this reveal about Kingpin hiring an actress to play his wife was quite something there.
Should have been a life model decoy. Normally, it's always a life model decoy if somebody just dies unexpectedly in Marvel Comics. For whatever reason, they were replaced at some point by an LMD, and that's why it's all going to be fine. So, but yeah, that was a weird, but I do think it does track a little bit with the obsessiveness of the Kingpin, that he would do something like that. It's not. It does fit with the later obsessiveness of the character towards his wife. So
sure, and I guess the fact that he just kind of got her back, and I could definitely see how he would maybe be very protective of her, but I didn't necessarily have an idea that he would go quite this far. So, but it turned out that it saved his wife for at least a little while longer. So next we have Matt Murdock holding a press conference to get the word out about Micah Sin, but his and Becky's accounts of what is going on is questioned by Foggy Nelson, of all people, at the urging of his wife Debbie. Harris then goes to Sin and professes her love to him, and it's met with indifference and a needless slap to the face, sending her to the ground. And he basically abducts her. So here is a character that was abducted for a while, gets saved immediately, then almost immediately, I guess, after this new character comes in, goes running away, and then gets abducted again.
Yeah.
So rough. So as the year ends, the story with Micah Sin is still going on. Debbie Harris is being held captive, and Professor Piper, who we met at the very beginning of the year and has been kind of the chaperone of this group throughout the entire time, seems able to look the other way on what Sin and his group is doing until a friend and colleague of his gets inadvertently killed by a member of the group. Piper then creates a diversion and frees Debbie Harris, who then returns home and tells exactly what happened to her with Micah Sin. When Foggy goes to confront Sin, he finds Piper dead and Sin's men looking to fight. Daredevil arrives, makes quick work of the tribesmen, but nobody is able to find the leader, Micah Sin. So that is where the year ends and the story ends. And frankly, I'm kind of ready for this story to end, if I'm being perfectly honest. There was just too much.
Yeah, and I think the believability of it, like, the idea really is that this is a guy who, he's a savage and he's able to succeed in New York because of the fact that somehow he just doesn't abide by any of the ways that people do things, and somehow that lets him get away with stuff. But the way that other people are treated, the way women are treated, everything by this guy, it's very, very difficult to see how he has made it through an entire year already. He does not have any superpowers. No. He's not some sort of, even Kraven the Hunter level character. He's just a dude who happens to have been lost in the jungle for his entire life, and somehow that allows him to dominate all of New York, including the Kingpin and Daredevil.
They also sort of make it like that he is like this quick study too, that he's like picking up on how to speak English well, how he's able to sort of kind of play the game that Kingpin plays as the year goes on as well, which feels entirely sort of unbelievable or very counter to the whole idea that, he was in this savage environment and he had to, be, basically brutal to survive for all of his time before coming to New York. So I don't know. It's okay, but I am definitely like raring to go with a different story, and definitely would love to get some Frank Miller back and be able to start looking at something else going on than this particular story.
Yeah, I think that this is also something where it's obvious they're trying to continue to do some stories that have a little bit more kick to them.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you have a bunch of different writers stepping on each other and slowing things down and making a mess of trying to tell what really needs to be a very well-constructed story to not go off the rails.
Yeah.
And so, it's still better than the stuff from the pre-150 era, probably, but maybe not by much at this point.
So as far as kind of the what's new here, as far as like new powers in that Hydra issue, Daredevil uses Widow's heartbeat to determine that there is a bomb under a pressure plate in the floor where she's being held. And that is how he's able to kind of avert disaster. And, because her heart starts racing as he steps closer to her. And he realizes that means there's obviously a bomb planted in the floor somewhere. So he then like leaves and then comes through the ceiling and saves her. So that seems like an incredible new power if that is something that, he's going to keep doing in the future.
Yeah. That's crazy.
As far as new supporting characters, we mentioned Horatio Piper, that professor that is kind of leading around Sin and his group. We had Stuart Schmidt, who is one of Murdock's childhood bullies. Gloriana O'Brien, or Glory, as she's sometimes called throughout all of this. We had Anton Ketpovic, who is the Russian defector that was supposed to be found by Hydra. And then Professor Otterson is the Horatio Piper's friend and colleague that ends up being killed, that caused him to gain a conscience about the things that were going on with Micah Sin and his group. As far as villains, we have obviously Micah Sin, we had the Trump, we had Crossbow, who was an assassin hired by the Lord Barrington Sin, the family member that wanted to take out Chief Micah. And then we had Paddy O'Hanlon, also known as the Gale, the Irish Republic Army killer that almost got the newest love interest for Daredevil.
Yeah.
So these are not characters we're probably going to see too much of, I feel like, after this year.
a relatively self-contained, let's call it, part of the Daredevil universe.
This week's Spotlight Story.
All right, Dwayne, I'm excited about the fact that you chose the issue you did as the Spotlight issue. This is the one I would have gone for as well. What is it about Daredevil number 208 from July of 1984, the deadliest night of my life, that made you decide this is the one you wanted to visit with us about?
I mean, this is a book where Daredevil takes on a killer house. How could you not talk about this? This is fantastic. This story, I think, definitely is not like any story I feel like we've read in pretty much our entire time reading Daredevil. This is that Harlan, Ellison, Arthur Byron cover book. I wanted to ask you about Harlan Ellison. I don't know much about this particular creator. Is he? This book, I also had a bit of a horror feel to it, in both kind of the tone and the look of it. Is that his style?
He's more into like science fiction and just interesting, quirky sorts of stories. Sometimes it's got a horror aspect to it, but a lot of times it's more just that he does dystopic futures and things like that occasionally. I would say that what he's known for is, back in the day, he did a Star Trek episode called The City on the Edge of Forever, which is by many sort of thought of as one of the best Star Trek episodes. He did a story called A Boy and His Dog, that if you remember, we ended up bankrupting a company that, one of the comic companies that tried to essentially be a knockoff on heavy metal by taking his Boy and a Dog story and turning it like to A Girl and a Koala or something. And he ended up suing him. He's done a ton of other things. He's won Edgars, Hugos, Nebulas, and occasionally he has dipped his toes into comics. There's also been a number of adaptations of his stuff by guys like Howard Chaykin, of some of his short stories and the like in comic form. So I think it's been kind of cool. Ellison is a really cranky dude, but he has maintained sort of a respect for comics, and comics artists and writers have maintained a respect for him over the years, where I would say he's kind of an honorary comic book writer, even though he's really only put in a very short time as a comic, professional. Mostly he's doing screenwriting, and he's doing novellas, and he's doing essays and stuff like that.
Gotcha. This just felt like kind of the most sort of developed sort of story across this entire year, and I really liked it. Yeah, so as we look at this book, Daredevil has just finished busting up a robbery when he spies a little girl wandering lost in the snow. He decides to follow her, and that little girl leads him into a dark alley. Daredevil walks into a trap, and a heavy door slams down behind him. He begins chasing the little girl down a long, windy steel corridor. The girl turns out to be an artificial bomb and explodes. Searching further into the maze, Daredevil learns that the corridors lead to the underbelly of a gigantic mansion. The entire 2-acre estate has been turned into an elaborate death trap. Daredevil then avoids being killed by various pitfalls, including trapdoors, sliding ramps, spikes from the floor, snakes, quicksand, you name it. There is all sorts of fun and interesting stuff that he ends up dealing with throughout all this. So he spends the entire evening surviving traps until he finally reaches the master bedroom of the estate. A pre-recorded video message left behind by an Elizabeth Dawes Sterling explains everything that he's been experiencing. Elizabeth, who herself has recently died, was the mother of the late Deathstalker. She blames Daredevil for her son's death and has created this elaborate scheme to get her revenge. Daredevil then soon hears with his wonderful hearing that there is a bomb set to blow up the entire mansion once the video finishes playing. So Daredevil takes that opportunity, finds a way out of the house just as the building explodes. Bloody and tired, he barely makes it to Natasha Romanoff's apartment where he can rest. And that is where the book ends. And the interesting thing is the next story is a follow-up to that, where he's actually dealing with more of these little robot kids that are trying to lure him back to this destroyed house that he spent the night, surviving the death traps from. So really sort of different and interesting story in a year that I think kind of was really focused on that whole Micah Sin story, and like we said, was sort of up and down throughout all that. Definitely had some sort of kind of pitfalls with it. This was just really interesting because you just did not really understand what was going on until you got about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the book, and you're just like, what is this? Why is he facing all this stuff? And then he finally gets to the master bedroom, and we get kind of that horror reveal that, this was all a plan set up from the get-go.
Oof. That's a lot, man. That's a lot. So, I like this story a lot. But it's also weird how this old lady's like, I won't defend what my son did, but I'm going to spend more than the GDP of a number of countries to transform my house into a death trap to kill you specifically because you were there when he died. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he went into a gravestone and the it's not like Daredevil actually even killed him. But this is a vicious old lady, man. Very, very vicious old lady.
I liked the fact that there was this callback to an old villain, the Deathstalker. Yep. I hadn't thought about him for a little while, and like I said, it just had this sort of a horror feel to it, both in the tone and then the look of the book as well, and just all the traps and not really knowing what was going on or why he's dealing with spikes in the floor and quicksand and all this sort of stuff. It's like you were just following a little girl, and then suddenly a door slams behind you, and you're now locked in this maze with all these death things.
Yep.
Why is this going on? It just doesn't make any sense, and I don't know. It just sort of, it felt out of place with regards to everything else that was going on this year, but it also was kind of the most interesting thing that happened throughout the whole year too.
Yeah, it's definitely out of place. I mean, it is essentially a completely on its own story,
Yeah.
The only thing about it is at the end, when he goes to Black Widow's place, and even there, through it all, no matter what goes wrong, it's never actually that unlikely that if Matt Murdock's really in trouble, he's going to show up like a bad penny at Natasha Romanoff's front door, right?
Yes.
So I mean, as a story that's kind of outside of the main narrative, it makes a lot of sense. I do like, though, that even now we do still have that. When Murdock's in trouble, there is one person he knows he can always go to. And I don't know if in modern years they've really preserved that relationship as much as I would have liked them to. But back in the day, for at least a decade now, that has been the case for Daredevil. So, yeah, this was a fun story. I would like to also know exactly how much of it is Ellison and how much of it is the other writer. Because it looks like Arthur Byron Cover does a number of the other stories along the way. He writes some other stuff. So I would assume that maybe Ellison did the plot for this, and then Cover did a lot of the dialogue and the like, but you never really know as far as what the actual division of labor was. In any case, it was well done. And I do think that Mazzucchelli's art here is solid. Like the first page especially has a bit of that that look of what he's going to look like. He actually has almost like a cross between Gene Colan and Gil Kane type of Daredevil on the first page. And it just shows how his style is just still evolving. So, very interesting.
All right, I think we've talked about 1984 with regards to Daredevil as much as we can for this week. Before we wrap things up, Dan, why don't you give us the takeaway for this week? This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, what is the takeaway for 1984? If we're looking back and want to remember one specific thing about 1984, what should it be?
I think that for Marvel, this is a golden year in a lot of ways, in terms of they're doing so many things and trying so many things and bringing out all of these interesting stories and the like. You know, Fantastic Four and X-Men are still motoring along. You've got new characters coming in. The Epic line is strong. And so much is going to change so quickly. You know, the thing about Marvel right now, we still only have one X-Men book. We still don't have this sort of collectible frenzy and the like. I think that what you're going to see starting in 85 and 86 and onward is you start ramping more and more into comics as collectibles with the foil covers and the multiple printings and the, you know, everything else. Right now, Marvel is near the peak of its productive output as a company that really is only making comic books and doing the best it can within an environment that still is relatively accessible to just about all comic book readers. 1984 is a time where if you take the books from this era, they would probably be something that would be pretty interesting to just about anybody across large swaths of the reading public. There's stuff there for people who want comics that are more advanced, you know, even up to the stuff like Void Indigo that's probably not really even acceptable to most folks, all the way down to the Star line for really young kids. And with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles now driving this new collectible craze, with a lot of the new things that'll start coming in as we get Dark Knight over at DC, and we get a lot of these big events every year coming in because of Crisis and Secret Wars. It all just gets muddy. But this is just sort of a beautiful little time when comic books were pretty amazing. I picked a good time to be 15 and a comic book fan, is what I think I'm saying.
It seems like that could be the case. It seems like that could be the case. I think that's a great takeaway. It definitely feels like this is sort of a tipping point. Like you reach here, and then suddenly things are going to start changing and changing to where we know them now, but very different than where they were before this.
Yep. And change isn't always bad.
No.
But I will say that there are a lot of things about the accessibility of the books at this time, the fact you didn't have to read the entire line. If you just want to read the Jackal Heights miniseries, boom, you can enjoy that. If you just want to read one of the graphic novels, you can enjoy that. The rest of the comic industry as well is doing really tremendous stuff, both in the mainstream, you know, with DC and with Marvel, and also with a lot of these other companies. There's just some really, really solid comic books across the board. And the more I looked through these getting ready for this year, the more impressed I was with what I was seeing and kind of where things were at this point. It's at that point where the expansion has started. A lot of the things have picked up steam, but we haven't actually started like a downhill train type of thing. You know?
So All that with the caveat of Daredevil maybe could have been a little bit better this year.
Daredevil was not the strong point. There have been years recently when Daredevil has carried the Marvel Universe and in many ways carried comics. That is not the case this year. But there were lots of other comics ready to pick up the mantle. And Daredevil will be back again in 2 years? 2 years. Talk to me in 86, and we'll see if anybody can catch him. So,
well, that sounds like a great takeaway for this year. That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.